What if I told you that your life is heading in the direction of your strongest thoughts? In his book, Winning the War in Your Mind, author Craig Rochelle makes this powerful statement that we as a church family want to explore over the next few weeks. And the statement is this: your life is heading in the direction of your strongest thoughts. Now, there is a deep spiritual truth behind a statement like this, but also actually some pretty legit science. It's well established in neuroscience that our brains are made to be wired and unwired. Here is what I mean by that. The more often we think a specific thought, the easier it becomes to repeat that way of thinking. This is why essentially we have something like cognitive behavior psychology to help us rewire the way we think. The more I think something, the more we essentially start to form what we call neuro pathways. That just basically means it becomes easier and easier to repeat that thought until it becomes really well established in our minds, in our hearts, and even in our spirits. Let's take the example of driving. If you've had your driver's license for, let's say, 10 years now, can you remember back when you just started learning how to drive? How difficult it was? How much mental capacity and concentration it took to think, clutch in, gear shift, not to let the car die when you accelerate too quickly. Whereas now, 10 years later, I hardly even think when it comes to driving. It's such an automatic response in my life by now, and that is the concept that we are talking about. The more often I think something, the more often I wire my brain to think a certain way, the easier it is going to become to keep thinking like that. Now, that's the scientific truth. The spiritual truth behind a statement like this is the following. We, as followers of Jesus, we are either living from the pathways, the way of thinking that is based on the truth of Jesus, the good news of his gospel, or on the flip side, we might be trapped in certain pathways, certain beliefs, certain ways of thinking that is unhelpful to our lives. We've fallen into the trap, the lie, the temptation that our enemy is selling us. And this is actually what Paul writes about in 2 Corinthians 10. From verse 3, he writes, "For though we walk in the flesh," so he's calling us humans like we are, he says, "we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to obey Christ." Now that word power, when he says that our weapons of warfare have power, that's actually where in English, if you go from Greek to English, where we get the word dynamite. It's speaking about the power of the good news, the power of God's opinion, the power of God's truth. But he also uses a word that we don't use a lot these days, but it is the word stronghold. Now the word stronghold is actually a military term. It comes from the idea of when nations and cities waged war against one another, each city had something that they would call a stronghold. The stronghold was typically found right in the center of the city, and it was the most reinforced, safest place where you could be during war. This is often where military leaders would take refuge because this stronghold had walls that would typically go 20 feet underneath the earth. It was a pretty strong place for you to take refuge in. Now, when it comes to the devil, our enemy, his agenda for you and me as followers of Jesus is to create strongholds of deception, to create strongholds of lies and temptation and sin and addiction that we become trapped in. So when you believe something that's untrue and it takes you away from God's purpose over your life or his provision or his healing, what does our enemy do? He reinforces that with a lie, with an untrue way of thinking, and he takes us captive into a stronghold. And today we want to journey with this whole idea of how do I win back the stronghold? How do I win back? How do I take captive my thoughts? Now, before I get to that, how do I even know if I am trapped in an untrue, unhelpful, sinful way of thinking? How do I know if I haven't, as a follower of Jesus, formed certain ways of thinking and living that are keeping me in bondage to sin, addiction, and the way that Jesus is not calling me to? Let me ask you this. Are your thoughts primarily characterized by panic, anxiety, fear, or peace? Do your thoughts easily drift to the negative versus the positive, or joy, or hope? When it comes to what you think about, are your thoughts more worldly? They focus on the here and now, on the pleasures of the here and now, or do they drift towards that which lasts forever? So, what if I'm stuck? What if I am busy losing the war in my mind? What if I am stuck in a stronghold of lies or deception that my enemy is keeping me captive in? How do I fight back? Again, science says that our brains can be rewired. And the way we rewire our brains is to form new neural pathways. But when it comes to faith, and that's what I want to talk about, when it comes to our faith, Paul calls that process simply this: it's the renewing of our minds. And he writes about that in Romans 12, verse 2, where he says, don't conform to the pattern of this world. So don't fall into the sin. Don't fall into the ways of the world. Don't fall into the stronghold, the temptation, the lie that the enemy is selling. But he says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what is God's will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. You see, this is such a powerful scripture because it shows us that transformation, freedom, breaking free from the lies and the deception, growing out of that doesn't come from me just trying harder. It doesn't come from me just trying harder to be a better Christian, to believe better, to do better, to be better. No, it actually says that the renewing of my mind comes from what? From meditating on God, allowing him to saturate me with his truth of who he is, allowing him to make tangible and to make real the good news of the gospel, his son Jesus, in my life. You see, this whole process of renewing my mind, it shifts my focus from myself to God. When I focus on him, when I allow him and his good work within me, my mind is renewed. I form new neural pathways. I don't slip that easily into temptation or sin or addiction because I am busy building a new stronghold, a stronghold that is built on God's truth, that is not built on the lie that I have bought into. So, my friend, what is it for you? What is the stronghold, the lie, the temptation that you have bought into? Maybe it's this, that you think you're worthless, hopeless, helpless. Maybe it's the fact that you think you're always going to be stuck in that same sin, that same addiction, that same cycle of guilt, pain, and shame. Maybe you're just in a space where you struggle to see the goodness of God in your life. Maybe it's identity. Maybe you've bought into the lie that God doesn't love you, that he can't use you, that he can't forgive you. You see, the way we break free from that, the way we win the war in our mind is firstly this: you need to identify what that stronghold is. Call it by name. You see, we can't win what we don't define. So number one would be identify that stronghold, call it by name. And then what do? It's simple. We replace, we take captive those unhelpful thoughts that keep me in bondage, and we replace them with the truth of what God says. Not what I say, not what the self-help books say, but we replace it with the truth of Jesus Christ and the gospel, the good news, the freedom from sin that he came to bring us. Why is this so important? Because Jesus says in John 8, verse 32, it's a very well-known passage of scripture where Jesus says the truth will set you free. He doesn't say trying harder will set you free, or even just knowledge will set you free. No, he says the truth, and he calls himself the truth. But he says you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So over the next few weeks, we're going to take a journey with this. We're going to get even more practical. So join us as we win the war in our minds. If you've enjoyed content like this, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe.